In the video on data validations, we covered why data validations are important. We also learned to configure drop-down lists and date validations using Excel's data validation features and save it with the cuboid format to be applied to the cuboid when it is downloaded. In this video, we will learn how to configure business validation rules using Velocity's features. Business rules can be found in the Boardwalk Velocity design framework. Let's look at what kinds of business rule checks can be set up. Cross-check involves checking the value of a column against another column cuboid. For example, we could check the values of in the region column in the transactions cuboid against the region column in the drop-down list cuboid. Check duplicates can be used to check duplicate values in a single column or a combination of columns. Check for non-keyboard character data can be used to trap characters that may be a result of a copy from a different application into Excel. These characters are sometimes not visible on the screen. Check for formula errors is to be used if a formula is resulting in an error. This may be a good option to ensure that the data one submits to the database is good. Check for equality can be used to check if a particular column has a specific value, and if not, it is flagged as an error. Check for non-equality can be used to ensure that the column does not contain specified values. Check for numeric type can be used to ensure that the column contains only numbers. Check for non-numeric type can be used to ensure that the column does not contain only numbers, but that the values entered contain letters and numbers. Check integer type is to be used when expecting integers to be entered in the column. Check for blank can be used when one wants a column to be left blank. Check for non-blank is to be used for mandatory columns, i.e., the column requires values to be filled or cannot be left blank. Check numeric greater than can be used if we want to check if a column should contain values that are greater than a certain number. Similarly, check numeric greater than or equal to can be used if we want to check if a column should contain values that are greater than or equal to a certain number. Check numeric less than can be used if we want to check if a column should contain values that are lesser than a certain number. Similarly, check numeric less than or equal to can be used if we want to check if a column should contain values that are lesser than or equal to a certain number. Check date will validate if the dates in the column are valid dates. Check drop-down value will validate if the values are part of a list, which can be a defined range too. Check column length equals to is to be used when a certain column is to have a fixed number of characters. For example, Social Security should have 9 characters, without the dashes or spaces. Check column length less than can be used if we want to limit the number of characters to be entered in a cell. For example, user comments are to be limited to 250 characters. Restrict formulae for a column can be used if one does not want the user to enter a formula in a certain column. Once you set up the business rules to do the validations, we need to set the validation on so that when the cuboid is submitted, the validation are activated. Similarly, you can turn the validation off too. You may want to test the validation rules setup. You can do so by clicking on Run Validation Rules. Now that we have an understanding of the different business rules that can be set up, let's configure a few of these rules. We have a drop-down defined in the region column of the transactions cuboid, which is dependent on the values of the column region in the drop-down lists cuboid. Let's set up a validation to ensure that the values entered in the region column are the same ones in the region column. We will use cross-check validation to ensure that. From the Business Rules menu, we select cross-check and add a new rule. A window pops up indicating that a new rule has been created. Click on OK to continue. Next, a business rule details form pops up, which will allow us to configure the validation rule. Let's spend a few minutes understanding the form. The first section contains the rules information. The name is fixed and should not be changed. We can enter our own rule description, which is only visible on this form. Rule type indicates the selection we made to get to this form. In this case, it cross-check. We can select to ignore rows of data for this validation. If we do, then we will need to provide a condition to skip the row. The default is no, and for our example, we will keep that. Error cell color allows us to pick a color to flag the error with. We can select the color using a color picker. Click on Pick when you are satisfied with the color you chose. We can have our own error message that we would like to be displayed when the error is caught. Operators and replacement values are not used for our example. The next section is where we configure the validation. The first section is to define what we would like to validate. The next section over is to define what we want to validate against. This section is not always needed, as we will see in some of the examples. However, it is needed for cross-check. We can define screen tips if we want to. The validation rule run-on is used during Excel merge, which we will cover in later videos. The yellow window is where help for various fields of the form is provided. Now to configure the rule. The column that we want to validate is region, and it belongs to the transactions cuboid, so we select the cuboid in the validate section. Next, from the cuboid list, we pick transactions. Notice the validate columns list gets populated with the name of the columns in the selected cuboid. We scroll down and select the region column from the list. Next, we click on the set key columns and also the set validate columns. Notice the validate type, validate cuboid ID, validate cuboid name, validate key columns, and validate columns get filled based on the selections made. Since we want to ensure that the region is present in the drop-down lists region column, we will configure the validate against parameters. Click on cuboid and select drop-down lists from the cuboid list. The validate against columns gets populated. Select the regions column and click on set key columns and set validate columns. Click on Save to save the configuration, and then Cancel to close the form. Now, let's test the rule that we set up. Navigate to the business rules, click on Cross-check, click on the rule, followed by Run Validation Rule. A pop-up shows that there are no errors encountered. Click OK to dismiss the pop-up. An invalid data cells pop-up window shows up. If there were invalid data cells, they would have showed up here. Click on OK to continue. Excel allows pasting values in cells that have drop-down lists. Let's simulate this behavior by copying a USD and pasting it in the region column and then running the business validation rule. The value AUSD is trapped by the cross-check validation. The invalid value is highlighted by the color we had assigned. The invalid data cells form has two sections. The top has the list of validation rules we have set up, and the bottom has all the invalid cells that failed the rules, listing the cell address, the name of the cuboid, the rule name, and the error message that we had configured. We can click on the radio button next to the cell address to navigate to the cell. Click on Close to exit. Let's set up another rule to test if values entered for TXN type column have the word wire in it. Navigate from Business Rules, click on Check for Equality, and add a new rule. A familiar form to configure business rules details pops up. Click on Cuboid, select Transactions from the list of cubides, select TXN type from the list of fields, and then click on Set Validation Columns button. Notice the data was populated in the fields. Next, to configure the value, click on Set Validate Values. In the pop-up, type the desired value. In our case, it is wire. Click on OK, and you will notice the value appearing in the Validate Values box. Let us add the rule description and the desired error message, and then pick a color to highlight the error. There is no other information needed on the form. So, save the configuration and cancel to exit. Let's test the rule now. We start by changing the value in cell D2 to wired, followed by running the rule from the Business Rules menu, selecting the rule setup for Check for Equality. The invalid data cells window shows up, indicating the cell address that failed the test and the error message that we configured. We can close the window. Notice both invalid cells are still highlighted. Let's set up another rule to test if values entered for TXN amount column are numeric in nature. Navigate from Business Rules, click on Check Numeric Type, and add a new rule. The form to configure business rules details pops up. Click on Cuboid, select Transactions from the list of cubites, select TXN amount from the list of fields, and then click on Set Validate Columns button. Notice the data was populated in the fields. Let us add the rule description and the desired error message, and then pick a color to highlight the error. There is no other information needed on the form. So, save the configuration and cancel to exit. Let's test the rule now. We start by changing the value in cell E2 by adding .00, followed by running the rule from the Business Rules menu, selecting the rule setup for Check Numeric Type. The invalid data cells window shows up, indicating the cell address that failed the test and the error message that we configured. We can close the window now. Let's set up another rule to ensure data values have been entered for TXN date, TXN ID, TXN indicator, TXN type, and TXN currency columns. Navigate from Business Rules, click on Check for non-blank, and add a new rule. The form to configure business rules details pops up. Click on Cuboid, select Transactions from the list of cubites, select TXN date, TXN ID, TXN indicator, TXN type, and TXN currency columns from the list of fields, and then click on Set Validate Columns button. Notice the data was populated in the fields. Let us add the rule description and the desired error message. We will keep the color. Since there is no other information needed on the form, we can save the configuration and cancel to exit. Let's test the rule now. We start by adding a new row and not entering any values, followed by running the rule from the Business Rules menu, selecting the rule setup for mandatory values. The invalid data cells window shows up, indicating the cell address that failed the test and the error message that we configured. We can close the window now. If we want to edit the rule and add more fields in the check for non-blank cells, we can edit the rule and reconfigure the rule by navigating to Show Rule Form for Check for non-blank rule. Our business rule form will pop up, and we would need to follow the steps to configure the rule. If no changes are needed, we can exit by clicking on Cancel. Now that we have a few business rules set up, let us test them all together. First, we need to turn the validation on, which can be done from Business Rules. Validation of Business Rules. Set Validate Cuboid on. A pop-up indicating that the business rule validation is enabled shows up. Click OK to continue. Next, run the business validation rules. The invalid data cells window pops up, showing all the cells that failed the business rules we set up: cross-check, equality check, numeric check, and mandatory check. Notice that cell E3 does not fail the numeric check, since there is no value there. We could have made TXN amount a mandatory field too, so that the user would have to provide values for that column too. Let's close the pop-up. Next, we will remove the cell coloring from the transaction cuboid by running test format and then try to submit the cuboid. Since we had turned the validations on for the cuboid, the validations are performed first, and we see all the invalid cells trapped as before. Let's close the pop-up. Now we have a new message, indicating that the validation rules have failed and hence the transaction's cuboid has not been submitted. This is the desired behavior. The errors can be fixed and then the cuboid can be submitted. In summary, validations are a fundamental part of software development that contributes to the security, reliability, and usability of applications. They help ensure that the data entering the system is correct and consistent with the business rules and expectations.